And the starter will be Thomas Graumann, and he is sitting here in this impressive bureau you see here in the screen. And I think it is very obvious for everybody of you why we invited him to present his observations on the documents on the Trinitarian debate. His latest monograph on the Acts of the Early Church Councils appeared Oxford 21 and summarizes in a way all his many former studies on the form and organization and reception of the councils in late antiquity. So on our flyer, he is announced with Cambridge as his home university, but actually he is acting professor at Humboldt University at Berlin at the moment. And so he is in person in Berlin, I think, but the screen in the back is from Cambridge, uniting both places. So let's not lose much time. Dear Thomas, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Uta, for this very kind introduction. Indeed, the background is Cambridge, and I'm still officially affiliated with Cambridge, so there's not much wrong on that front. Is my audio level such that you can all hear me? Okay, that looks fine. I've been tasked to talk about the Council of Rimini document 5911 in particular, which is the so-called second session, and I will wonder to what extent we can learn about debate in this context. So I've given this a tentative title like this: Jerome's account of the second session of the Council of Rimini and the question of conciliar debate and documentation. I start with a brief look into the background and preparation of the council. After Constantius II became sole emperor in 351 CE, he pursued a religious policy aimed at reconciling the conflicting doctrinal parties and reuniting the Christian churches in both parts of the empire. A series of synods in the West in particular attempted to remove resistance against the deposition of Athanasius, to resolve the dispute over the case of Fortinus, and to arrive at a doctrinal settlement. In this latter direction especially, several meetings at Sirmium during Constantius' residency there discussed and explored doctrinal formulae to underpin such a settlement. As the conclusive and crowning step in this process, Constantius planned a major synodical project. The sources give conflicting indications, not easy to reconcile, and scholarship is divided accordingly, whether this plan had initially entailed an empire-wide synod, or whether separate meetings of bishops in the East and in the West, respectively, had been planned from the outset, perhaps in learning the lessons of the disastrous failure of the Council of Serdica in 343. In the end, the Western Synod, that is our topic today, was invited to Ariminum, Rimini, as part of an elaborate choreography of meetings, delegations, and negotiations at court. The complex church political entanglements and the theological discussions in the 350s and at the council have been meticulously studied and analyzed by Hans-Christoph Brennecke, I welcome you, Winrich Löhr, and Yves-Marie Duval, to only name the most important. It's not necessary or possible to retrace those studies here. It's sufficient, rather, to note that in preparation of the council, a small group had agreed as a basis for the envisaged settlement the so-called Fourth Sirmian Formula, also known by its opponents as the Dated Creed, that is of 22nd of May 359. It provided the basis for deliberations of the bishops at Rimini and was meant to be agreed by the bishops there. However, an overwhelming majority of bishops rejected it outright and instead insisted on keeping the traditional faith of Nicaea. They formulated a list of anathemas which rebutted traditional Arian sentiments as well as more recent Sabellian conceptions, and they condemned and excommunicated the sponsors of the Sirmian formula, Valens of Mursa and Orsacius of Sigindunum, and their supporters. This is a very rough, broad-brushed sketch of a much more complex series of events describing the so-called first session of Rimini. In following the emperor's instructions for the council, the bishops then sent 10 delegates to the court, as did their opponents. The representatives of the majority, led by Restitutus of Carthage, were retained in Nicaea in Thrace, where after a time they signed a somewhat altered form of the Sirmian Creed, declared not to consider Valens and his supporters heretics, and entered into communion with them. It was the very opposite of what had been their mandate, and completely reversed the position and decisions of the council on both doctrine and on discipline. When they returned to Rimini, together with Valens, the bishops did not initially receive them at all. And there unfolded the events that are the immediate context of our document and the subject of my talk. These events are known as the second session of Rimini. It is the standard assumption that document 5911 represents the proceedings of this second session and even contains documentary evidence from it. We shall examine it now. So my second point is Jerome's Altercatio Luciferani et Orthodoxi and his account of Rimini. To better understand the character and the historic value of the text before us, the brief examination of Jerome's Altercatio with the Luciferans is required. Unfortunately, the work poses more questions than it provides answers. Its date and place of composition and the intention of Jerome in taking up the pen are all uncertain and controversially discussed in scholarship. The most recent editor, Eline Canellis, discusses the various scholarly proposals at length and cautiously, but to my mind plausibly, opts for a composition of the work in 378 to 9 and in the East, where Jerome sojourned between 374 and 82. If written in 378 to 9, it places Jerome at or near Antioch, not Constantinople, which is relevant. The question matters for our examination of the document before us, as we shall need to hypothetically consider how and where Jerome could have come across the documentation from Rimini, which he claims to utilize. We only need the briefest of introduction to the structure and genre of Jerome's treatise. As an Altercatio, it takes its cues from a forensic confrontation and employs the rhetorical and dialectical means appropriate to such a setting and suited to overcome an opponent. The relevant passages, however, find their place in the second part of the work, where the confrontation recedes and which is more historical in character. Here, the interventions of the Luciferan interlocutor come to resemble mere prompts that allow the Orthodox speaker to expound his thinking. What is it that Jerome wants to teach in this manner by narrating the events at Rimini? It has routinely been noted that he aimed to excuse the bishops at Rimini signing the Hermian formula, which in the eyes of Luciferans made them heretics. They had fallen victim to a cunning fraud on the part of the Hermian protagonists. This assessment is prevalent already in the sources Jerome used, chiefly Hilary of Poitiers, as we shall see. Despite of its more strongly historical flavor, and despite of the overarching intention to exculpate the signing of the Hermian formula, Jerome does not present a quasi-historical, slightly apologetic account of Rimini. His intention is not to inform us of the circumstances and conditions of this extraordinary event. The narrative is in fact set up by a precise question asked by the Luciferan in the paragraph just before our document starts, and I quote from the Luciferan speaking here, giving the English translation straight away. But I ask you, please explain to me every reason why the church receives those who come from the Arians. Explain it to me not as to an opponent, but as to a pupil. Because although I cannot respond to you with my tongue in my animus, soul, heart, I have not yet agreed to you. Two elements of note emerge. One, what follows is meant to be an historic illustration and justification of the Church's reconciliation with repentant Arians and of their reception back into communion. This perspective, I argue, shapes the way in which Jerome presents his material and motivates his selection of evidence from the sources. So to repeat, document 5911 is not a contribution to the history of the Council of Rimini, but a selective presentation of events that illustrate the Church's practice of reconciliation. Secondly, the Luciferan concedes his inability to provide a reasoned, discursive response to Jerome's prior, we must think, arguments, and confesses to an internal unease located in the animus. He is unpersuaded, not in strictly logical dialectical terms, but on a different, personal level. If this statement is not simply a rhetorical device on the part of Jerome to mark the gradual successful progression of his treatise, we may ask whether the presentation of Rimini is also not primarily concerned with accumulating additional discursive logical arguments, but to address specifically the inner reluctance of the interlocutor by focusing on the emotional dimension of the reconciliation and readmission of heretics. In fact, Jerome's account at various places, as we shall observe, gives a highly emotive depiction of events and portrays the protagonists at Rimini themselves in a highly charged emotional engagement with the situation. So with this, I come to our document 5911, which has been circulated, and I haven't put a screen share or anything because I assume it's available to you. So let's take a closer look at the document. Jerome very clearly integrates source material into his narrative and transforms it in the process. The editors, 3 of them are present right now. So, okay, the editors alert us to the interweaving of source material and Jerome's words by using a different font, printing what they think are Jerome's words in a smaller size. What kind of a text is what remains and is printed in larger font? Does Jerome cite a conciliar document? And if so, what kind of a document is it? Can we even reconstruct it? In line with previous scholarship and building on it, the editors speak in their introduction to the document of the passages as an excerpt from the Acts, ein Auszug aus den Akten. Jerome himself refers his readers at the end of our passage to the Acts of the Synod, where more details may be found and from which he claims he took his material. Let us then, in a first step, try to read the adduced passages as parts of a conciliar document to test this assertion. So I look at the character and form of the document initially, as you might have suspected. The text begins, line 1, with the consular year. Jerome must have lifted it from a dated document such as those found in Hilary's 2 books against violence and Orsacius, which survives in fragments. Yet the date is not a quotation from an opening section of a conciliar protocol or minutes. Such minutes conventionally start with a precise date, name the location, usually but not consistently followed by a list of participants. An example of such a protocol in our immediate context is document 59.9, preserved by Hilary, about the negotiations at Nicaea. Jerome then does not cite conciliar minutes, but dates the events he's going to narrate more generally. His account goes on to lead up to the subsequent citation of the formula agreed at Rimini, which he denounces as an infidelitas, an anti-faith, or the opposite of the faith. The formula is a version of the formula of Nicaea, of said document 59.9, modified with elements from Western theological traditions, as the editors succinctly indicate in the introduction. I refer you to their remarks. Its overall concern, I've mentioned it, goes back to the Fourth Simian Creed, devised in preparation of the council and forcefully rejected in the first session. Repeatedly, Jerome interjects interpretation and commentary into the citation, noting in particular that it was in part perfectly acceptable and uncontroversial, and that other phrases sounded pious, but camouflaged the doctrinal poison contained therein. The omission and rejection of Usia language also attracts his comment. It seemed innocuous, since the bishop saw its sense preserved, even if the term was rejected. So Jerome. These comments very clearly aim to excuse the bishop's signature to such a document. The passage does not, however, give any indication as to the circumstances of the drafting and approval of the texts, or locates it in any conciliar setting, such as, for example, a plenary session. We cannot extrapolate about debate or other modes of interaction that account in procedural terms for the modifications when compared to the formula of Nicaea. And I only mention sort of in passing that Sulpicius Severus and other later historians elaborate on this obscure process, but that is not something I can talk about here. In his interconnecting remarks, Jerome locates a subsequent declaration by Valens in front of the Praetorian prefect Taurus and describes them as secrete gesta, done in secret. Perhaps we can speculate that this critical remark played on a note in his sources, stating that business was conducted in the secretum of the prefect's palace. But this is speculation, of course, and whether the doctrinal formula also originated in such a context has to be uncertain. In our search for debate, related events may illustrate potential settings and forms of interaction at the origins of the formula. The synodical letter from the first session reports how the Hermean group around Valens presented a text publici et in concilio, publicly and in council, perhaps plenary, full council. When it did not gain support, they suggested aliter esse conscribendum, it should be written differently. They proposed, in other words, to use their text as a draft to be discussed, amended, corrected, and rephrased as necessary. We may wonder whether such a process should be imagined in the form of an open dispute in plenary session, or perhaps more plausibly as the work of a drafting commission. Crucially, however, such an imaginary process of redrafting never happened on the occasion, and the remark locating events publicly in council only describes the initial presentation of the text and its immediate rejection. The sources do not allow here, or in the case of the formula agreed at the second session, to identify traces of the proceedings and of any deliberation and dispute they may have entailed. Jerome's citation and critique of the formula provides no evidence for the modes and processes of its creation. After the selective citation and critical assessment of the doctrinal formula, Jerome narrates Valens' protestation in the presence of the prefect Taurus that he was no Arian. I've mentioned it already. The narrative provides the transition to a second set of material from the council and Jerome's presentation of what is perhaps a further event in its progression. This passage again needs close attention. And I turn to this part now. So let's begin once more, quite boringly, with considering the formal characteristics and features of the document. Jerome first offers a very imprecise relative dating, alia die, after the undated event in the presence of Taurus in the preceding narrative. This time he gives a location as well, in Ecclesia. He describes the gathering as the running together concurrentibus of bishops and lay crowds. Yet it's again starkly different from an opening section of a conciliar, of official conciliar minutes. Either he had no properly dated document in front of him, or else he's disinterested in retaining the conventional features of an official record, which would be peculiar, since not much later he insists on the official and public character of his source or sources. That's the paragraphs 9 and 11. The running together of bishops and laity, furthermore, does not exude the air of a formal gathering. It chimes instead with other elements Jerome uses subsequently to create a sense of drama, a sense of dramatic effect. Of the following paragraph, the editors only identify the name of Bishop Mitsonios of Byzacena as part of the document. In fact, the reasoning given for his leadership, old age, must be an extrapolation by Jerome. It is completely unusual for council minutes to give such explanations. Since Mitsonius' episcopal see does not give him any preeminence, and because Jerome cannot have come across his name as a leading theologian, which he is not, Jerome must have concluded that only a conventional social marker, such as old age, could justify his leadership. Mitsonius then doubtless exercises presidential function in the relevant passage by introducing the next agenda item and ordering the reading of an unspecified text. The approval of the council to this procedural move is conventional. This passage could be part of an official protocol. There follows the reading of said unidentified text by one Bishop Claudius, which Jerome narrates in abbreviated fashion, and to which he again adds his starkly critical assessment of the text which is not cited. The reading prompts the intervention of Valens. Two verbs are used to indicate his speaking. Exclamavit et dixit. He shouted and said. The second, dixit, is the word routinely used in conciliar minutes to mark speaking. There follow 6 anathemas, each in turn followed by the echoing collective shouts of those gathered, anathema. The 6 anathema sentences are not individually introduced, no speaker is named. We must infer that Jerome's general introductory remarks substitute for an identification of Valens in each case, if the document used by Jerome followed the pattern of individual notation regularly observed in official minutes. The notation of collective responses draws suspicion. They are introduced in 5-fold variation. Ab universis consonatum est, omnes responderunt, ab omnis acclamatum est, similiter dictum est, omnes conclamaverunt. Before, after the final anathema in this group, no direct speech follows, but Jerome's report of reactions in the room. The editors print these phrases in large font as elements belonging to the purported conciliar minutes used, allegedly by Jerome. Yet this is improbable. The notations disagree with convention in several ways. First, conciliar minutes do not use linguistic variation. Speaking is regularly and with virtually no exception introduced by a simple dixit, NN said. For collective shouts, acclamations or conclamations, such as those recorded here, the corresponding expression is dixerunt cuncti, dixerunt omnes, or similar, and frequently also the phrase synodus dixit. Here, by contrast, we read consonatum est, responderunt, acclamatum est, dictum est, conclamaverunt. 5 different verbs, 3 of which are use passive voice. Passive voice, to my knowledge, hardly ever indicates speaking in minutes. There is as always, there is an exception that is on my mind. But I only know a couple of instances. So only after a much later anathema voiced by Claudius at the end of our section do we encounter the conventional usage dixerunt cuncti, that's 10:7 on page 482. In the earlier instances, the terminological variation owes, to my mind, everything to the writer and the stylistic pretensions of Jerome, and does not match the working habits of stenographers and notaries. His intention must be the creation of an arresting account, trying to present a lively and increasingly emotive scene. Valens shouts to interrupt proceedings. His repeated statements find a lively response in the shouts of those gathered in each case before the scene erupts in collective exuberance. The narrative, in other words, prepares for the scenes of jubilation following the sixth anathema. Jerome here speaks of plausus and tripudium, both of the bishops and of everybody else in church. Clapping of hands, plausus, is not a form frequently signaling approval and consent in conciliar documents I've read, but I have to admit I have to do another search. It's not implausible, but I wasn't well enough recently to be absolutely sure. But it's not something that sort of rings much of a bell with me. Tripudium certainly is unique. Originally, it designates a dance performed in honor of the god Mars, or the noise created by the casting of grain in the context of augury. Jerome could have been thinking of the stamping of feet or the general noisy commotion caused by events. At any rate, he chose an exceptionally rare word and one that's not used in conciliar minutes at all, doubtless to showcase his artistic prowess as a writer. What is more, conciliar minutes do not normally record the behavior of participants at all, except for exceptionally and essentially important circumstances, which one can argue is the case here. Nevertheless, Jerome is clearly aware of the improbable nature of what he reports. All the more forcefully, he insists on the reliability and trustworthiness of his narrative. Not content with one, he gives three supporting observations. First, ecclesiastical documents found in public archives. Two, the fact that events are of recent memory. Three, participants are still alive, and if we wanted to go on counting, perhaps four on top of it, or yet another claim, namely that even the Arians do not dispute the events. One could suspect there's rather too much emphasis on corroboration. I want to pick out the one element most important to our examination, the reference to documents. Taken together with its mention of synodical acts at the end of our passage in paragraph 11, these remarks are often believed to identify the origins of Jerome's knowledge. Yet on close reading, they do no such thing. Jerome invites the imagined reader, stepping out of the dialogical form of the treatise, to scrutinize public archives. He does not state that such an archive is where he found the acts, let alone which one. If the Altercatio was indeed composed during his sojourn in the East, but not in Constantinople, the expectation that Latin acts from a synod in Rimini should have been stored and retrieved by Jerome in a public archive there is improbable. There's no reason why even a metropolis such as Antioch should have been concerned with these documents. Records of ecclesiastical dealings were held in public secular archives, but not widely distributed beyond those directly involved. The documents in question would hypothetically be held at Rimini, of course, in Constantinople, if for no other reason than that the prefectores would have passed them up the chain of command, and because of the negotiations before Constantius. Additionally, perhaps at other major Western sees, there is a remark that suggests that Auxentius of Milan had access to them, and not least in Rome. The last two locations, however, might be better explained by record keeping in episcopal archives than in public ones, to which Jerome refers. And that may also be said for an episcopal archive at Antioch, of course. It seems the reference specifically to public archives, not ecclesiastical record keeping, is principally a ploy to claim non-partisan authority. And what is more, Jerome does not claim he used certain archives. He simply states a general expectation about the keeping of ecclesiastical records without so much as hinting at a specific location, context, or activity, dare we say, research on his part. So you noticed I'm doubtful of Jerome's self-justification and the implied document use. Yet it is, of course, impossible to prove his non-use of original documents from the Synod with any more certainty than asserting the reality of it. That said, a number of scholars have, from different observations, come to similar assessments. Jerome, it appears, used the documentation found in Hilary's treatise. What he presents from the Council of Rimini is of a second-hand nature. That required different talk. Where does this evaluation leave our investigation into the proceedings at Rimini and the role debating formats potentially played in them? Both in the modification of the formula of Nicaea and in the presentation of anathemas, there is indisputably an echo of real doctrinal discussion, even if the forms and modes of such discussions are not accessible to us. The anathemas presented in church, was it even a formal session, were clearly scripted in advance and not the spontaneous expression of a dramatic moment in which theological clarity and the acute marking of boundaries of orthodoxy suddenly emerged and allowed for the emotional coming together of all and the overcoming of suspicions and reservations towards violence in particular. The joyful reception back into the fold of Valens and his associates, celebrated and almost theatrically performed in church, is what Jerome wants us and wants this vociferant interlocutor to perceive. A reception and reconciliation, on the other hand, that was not unconditional, thoughtless and frivolous, but that rested on the very public denunciation by Valens of any Arian association and heretical tenets in the strongest possible terms, anathema to them. He could be accepted into communion in good faith. That hindsight revealed him to be disingenuous, smuggling in a fraud, did not discredit the actions of the bishops or the principle of ecclesiastical reconciliation. That appears to be Jerome's message. That these actions and sentiments, and the sentiments they revealed, were also what characterized the bishops' interaction at Rimini, is less evident and less assured. Did they see the need to bring to a formal conclusion the shifting of their positions that must have taken place in many conversations between different people in different settings and stretched over some time and about which we can only speculate, in order in an elaborate communal performance of regained mutual trust and communion, as well as the recitation and acclamation of agreed boundaries of orthodoxy that had emerged from such conversations. On such a reading, the public performance and presentation of doctrinal unity achieved was equally as important as the deliberations and the repeated redactions of draft statements, and as the potential debates about suitable terminologies and their conceptual implications for the correct faith obtaining in all such contexts. The success of doctrinal deliberation required the public demonstration of accord and consensus. Such an analysis does not seem improbable to me, but it cannot rely on Jerome's narrative as original evidence from the council, at least not without discussing his intentions and comparing in particular the documents cited in Hilary of Poitiers and the accounts of Sulpicius Severus. That, however, must be left for another talk. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. And you see the applause in the audience. And well, I just want to give over now to Samuel Fernández from Chile, who is my colleague in organizing this seminar here. And please, Samuel, just start right ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I received the interesting presentation of Thomas Graumann in advance, and I therefore could read it slowly and with Jerome's text on my desk. Graumann shows the complexity of this kind of sources and, as the editors do, highlights the need of distinguishing source material from Jerome's narrative. Graumann's analysis of the date, the place, and especially the intention of the text gives helpful clues for the interpretation of the document. If Jerome wanted to justify the Church's reconciliation of the repentant Arians, the meaning of some passages of the document became more clear. In addition, the contrast between the linguistic regularity of the conciliar acts and the emotional character of Jerome's language, pointed by Thomas Graumann, seems a trustworthy criterion to distinguish source material from Jerome's narrative and commentaries. Jerome aimed to justify the Church's practice of reconciliation. On the one hand, according to this aim, Jerome selected, modified, and shape the material of his narrative. On the other hand, within this selected narrative, he transmitted, indeed, source material from the contemporary document related to the Synod. Graumann's presentation confirms the basic reliability, at least, of the anathemata, supported also by the editors of Athanasius Werke. Taking for granted the basic trustworthiness, at least, of the anathemata pronounced by Valens, I wish to reflect on the boundaries of orthodoxy, according to the criteria of the bishops of the 4th century. Valens declared that he was not an Arian. However, ancient and modern authors labeled him as an Arian and accused him of fraud and duplicity. The problem obviously revolved around the definition of the label Arian or Arianism. The big question is, what did Arian mean in the 4th century? As in the 4th century there were different definitions of Arianism, this question has different answers according to the geographical settings and the theological traditions. There were several criteria for identifying Arianism: whether the Son is from nothing or from God, whether the Son is from the will of God or from the substance of God, and therefore the language of ousia, and when it is necessary to locate the origin of the Son of God. That is the issue of time, between inverted commas. To address this topic, I selected one of these aspects, that is the issue of time, regarding the origin of the Son of God. The document shows that the issue of time was critical for the bishops at Rimini to distinguish between heresy and orthodoxy. I will show some. I will share my screen. If you see in the creed, twice appear the issue of time: ante omnia saecula, ante omne principium, natus est ex Deo. And then when Jerome speaks in his words, the doctrine, the Arian doctrine, according to him, means that erat tempus quando non erat. And Valens declared that he was not an Arian. On the other hand, in the anathemata, we also have, if anyone denies that Christ our Lord, the Son of God, was begotten of the Father before all ages, anathema sit. Si quis filium Dei non dixerit aeternum cum patre, anathema sit. Si quis dicit erat tempus quando non erat filius, anathema sit, etc. And the last one also has ante omnia secula and not ante omnia omnimo tempus. That is, 4 out of 7 anathemata has implied the issue of time. But that is, all the Arian the so-called Arian statements condemned by Rimini imply that there was tempus or seculum, that is, time or age, when the Son of God was not. All the Arian statement imply tempus or seculum. However, did Arius actually support that there was a time or age when the Son was not? We know that Arius said the Son came into subsistence before time and before ages. That is, Arius denied this so-called Arian statement. However, he stated that before the Son was begotten, he did not exist because he was not unbegotten. For Arius, there was once when the Son was not, but he did not support that there was a time or an age when the Son was not. According to Arius, then, the Son of God exists ante tempora, but not ab aeterno. However, if we go to other alleged Arians, we find that Eusebius of Caesarea, he explicitly says that the Son exists, that is, the Father exists before the Son and exists before his birth, since the Father is the only unbegotten. That is, also for Eusebius, the Son exists ante tempora, but not ab aeterno. Instead, George of Laodicea, since he identified the Son like any creature, he states that the Son does not exist ante tempora. The Second Creed of Antioch, to quote some Eusebian or Arian synod, support the same doctrine of Arius. That is, if anyone teaches that a time or a period or an age exists before or passed before the Son was born, let him be anathema. And the creed of Sirmium, we have the same doctrine. That is, to summarize, we have that Eusebius of Caesarea believes that the Son was ante tempora, Alexander of Alexandria ab aeterno, Arius ante tempora. The Arianism presented by the summaries by Alexander state that the Son was created in tempore. Athanasius of Anasarbus, for example, also has the same doctrine, support the same doctrine. Eusebian or Arian synods supported that the Son was ante tempora, and the dated creed, and Valens himself supported the same idea. Hilary of Poitiers understood this difference between ab aeterno, ante tempora, et in tempore, and he stated that he complained that many believers putant id ipsum ante tempora esse quod semper est. That is, he complained that many believers identify ante tempora with ab aeterno, which is the problem that we have. Sorry, oops. Yep. So the bishops at Rimini put Valens to the test. They wanted to establish whether Valens was Arian or not. However, For this purpose, they demanded Valens to profess a doctrine that was not supported by Arius himself. Here, the summaries of Arian doctrine, so-called Arian doctrine, plays an important role. Arius did not profess that there was a time or age when the Son was not. Arius supported that the Son was posterior to the Father because begetting or creation of the Son implies the priority of the Father, as Eusebius supported. But Arius did not profess that there was a time or age when the Son was not. This fluidity of ancient and modern definitions of Arianism has been and still is a cause of persistent misunderstandings. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for these additional remarks on the backgrounds on the anathema and the question of time, with a look at the Arian debate right from the beginning. And so the floor is now open for discussions of either Samuel Fernández or go back to the presentation of Thomas Graumann. May I start with a slight question to Thomas? You said that about the archives, that the documents are not existent in Antioch probably, and that he is more than generally referring to where someone had to go and take a look at archives or so. And perhaps this may be true within the East, where Jerome actually was when writing this text, but his addressees are in the West. So if you take into consideration about the addressees of this work against the Alternatio Luciferianae et Orthodoxy, the possibility that there are archives about including documents of Rimini is more higher, I think. Or what do you think?
Yeah, and I said as much almost. What I try to say is this remark by Jerome does not indicate where he, by way of research, found his documents. Probably got them from Hilary. So he doesn't say, I found them in a public archive. He says, go to a public archive. And indeed, that steps out of the narrative, of the dialogue, where he now addresses his potential reader. If you say in the West, yes, and there should be places where it can be found in the West, in Rimini, of course, and in ecclesiastical archives, probably in other places too. But he insists on the public secular archives as the sources for the proper documentation, which I suspect, but this can be no more than a suspicion, he does on purpose to indicate how absolutely reliable this material is, to which he refers, rather than saying, oh, you find it, the bishop in Milan has it, or the bishop in Rome has it, or whatever else he might have said instead. That's my point. So it's not to say archives didn't exist or the material wasn't available in archives. We wouldn't have it if it weren't. But he did not get it from an archive, to put it bluntly. He got it from Hilary. That's my point.
Yeah,
yeah.
thank you.
Brennecke is doubtful, and he'll surely put me right on that one.
Yeah. Right. Who was first? I think Xavier Morales raised his hand first. Please.
No, Professor Brennecke was first.
Okay, Hans-Christoph, please.
Okay. Herr Graumann, we have sometimes we can find archives. The Synod of Antioch 379 the text is very uncertain, but we have a little bit, and there's also, you can look at the archive, but there is you can look at the archive in Rome, and this is the difference. Yeah, there is but archives where we had.
If I may, just to confirm that, indeed, Rome is a very strong contender.
The whole text you can find in the archive in Rome. It's in Antioch 79.
Yeah, so Rome, absolutely, and you know from the debates that Augustine had with the Donatists, so-called, lots of materials from all manner of North African archives, but they're all local. So that's
much later, Augustine. In the mid of the 4th century, we have not so many texts. The problem, no? And it's not so clear. But we, when we made the edition, we had our doubts in this text. You can see it in the introduction. We are not so sure.
Thank you.
Xavier Morales, please.
Yes, very interesting. The accurate and detailed commentary of Professor Graumann. I just wanted to point at the so-called first session at Rimini. I think the hypothesis that Hilarius would be the source, Jerome's source, is very interesting, and we have the documents we have of the first session come from Hilarius, and we have formulas very similar to what Professor Graumann supposes would be the source to Jerome. Just one example, Thomas, you pointed to the fact that a normal minute would not say when the bishops answer to the anathema, we would not have an elaborate formula like with a passive, ab responsum est ab universis episcopis, and actually in the document transmitted by Hilarius, we have the proposition by Grecianus of Calais to condemn Valens and his friends, and the document says Universi Episcopi dixerunt placet. Universi Episcopi dixerunt placet, and it's very similar to what we have in Jerome. The only thing is that we do not have the active formula, but a passive, and this could be the modification, the stylistic modification by Jerome. What do you think about that?
Yes, you noticed that in that sentence, when I pronounced it, I sort of was a little reluctant to say, look, there's always a few exceptions. This is one of them. You point out quite rightly that at the end of 59.8, ab universis episcopis dictum est placet et subscripserunt, that's a passive. But we could start discussing whether this is a summative remark of a collector rather than the citation from the document. But anyway, there's always an exception. By and large, from the acts that I have read, and that's quite a few, it's passive is unusual, is to say it mildly.
Yes,
Synodus dixit or omnes dixerunt or something like that.
Yes. My point was not to contradict you. On the contrary, I think that this could be the proof that effectively, only with if Jerome had only the text by Hilarius and not the minutes, he could have written what he wrote.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I don't want to dispute my own presentation, but of course the formula is so ubiquitous that I don't know how much it can carry on its own, but I think there are other supporting observations. But thank you for pointing that out to me. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for these remarks. Perhaps in a second edition of our documents, we change this introduction to verses into petit. Mark Del Cogliano, please.
Hi, so I have a question for Dr. Graumann too. So you say that Jerome is getting his material from Hilary, but as I understand it, there's no source in Hilary which has these exact anathemas, right? And the first session's anathemas like come from manuscript, I think, right? And now there is a lot of overlap in those two sets. So are you implying that these anathemas are a kind of redacted version of what is associated with the first session?
No, I'm not suggesting that the anathemas of the first and of the second, they're all one thing and they all belong together. No, they're specific to the two different occasions, and I think the editors have also pointed that out, to my mind, very convincingly. This is not the same thing. You are right, of course. This the claim that Hilary should be chiefly the source of this has to remain hypothetical to an extent, because not least because Hilary's work is, of course, fragmentary in the way it's come down to us, and it's never a good argument to say it must have been in the part that we are missing. That's not a very strong methodological remark. So I can't offer more than an hypothesis. Likelihood, to me, suggests that rather than looking into some archival research on Jerome's part, I would assume he, in the main, relied on Hilary. Don't think I can be any more certain than that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Are there further questions, remarks? Well, when we were working on the critical edition of the documents, I remember we had among ourselves, many discussions about this text, if we should include it at all or not. The other possibility would be just to refer to the text in the general introduction and not to quote it. But then we decided again, well, it could be much more in it than just referring the reader to the text, and he or she has to look up by him or herself. So we decided to print it. And it's always, of course, well, how could we present it? And it's a bit like you have to decide between white or black. And so there are shades of gray in between. So what is mainly a document, or what is more Jerome, voice of Jerome? And but we decided only to opt between normal characters or petit, and not to differentiate between 2 or 3 different grades of the printing. So
my aim was not at all to criticize you as the 3 of you and the others involved as editors. It's just as a rhetorical ploy, I have to set it up as a, why do I find the introductory remarks worthy of comment? And I said, because you print them in this way, and I wonder whether it's actually that. So look, yes. I hope you didn't hear it as a criticism of the edition, which is marvelous, as many reviewers have always confirmed, and I think I've said that many times in private as well. So this is just to try and offer some nuance, which quite rightly you can't do by typeface. Absolutely, yeah. So this wasn't meant to be a criticism of the edition.
No, that's not the way I understood it. I think just, well, what is the reason to make these editions or to prepare this series of documents is to provoke discussion and to give the material to go into further discussions and to go on. And this is a very special text because it's not just like in Socrates or so to have something like a quoted document, but this is a double layer or even threefold layer of disputation we have here. We have the disputation, what was going on in Rimini. In the background, the old disputation, Samuel hinted at what is labeled as Arianism or not. And then we have the 20 years, roughly speaking, later now in Jerome, his disputation, and he has his argumentation, and he's arguing with presenting a former argumentation. So we have, in a way, different levels of disputation included within this document, which makes it so tricky to get around with what is Jerome doing here, actually. So, but it's not me. I don't want to give a monologue here now.
Do you allow one more remark? I've mentioned twice Sulpicius Severus without interpreting him in that context. He describes the presentation of anathemas quite differently. His two local heroes, the two bishops from Gaul, they expressed a particular one, and then he doesn't go on to cite other ones. But if hypothetically it was so that all these anathemas are not all valens, but there were other anathemas potentially expressed by other bishops as well, not just by Claudius at the very end in our section. The whole procedure, what it might have meant to achieve, needs a completely different discussion. We've assumed, and I have assumed that too, that this is Valens purifying himself of the stench of Arianism. But perhaps if other bishops also pronounced anathemas, the purpose of what the bishops did in Rimini needs to be constructed in a different way or construed in a different way. But that is a tricky question and depends on what you make of the reliability of other sources and to what extent one is willing to speculate on what they may or may not have wanted to achieve.
Yes, and one has to add the apologetic intent of Jerome, of course. So I think I'm a bit hesitant to read it just face value as a document of what was going on in Rimini. One has to look at why is Jerome presenting the debates in this way, and he has an apologetic intention, of course. And so as Samuel Fernández showed, it is a bit a reduction of the debate on Arianism just on the question of tempus. And I think probably this is not really actually the topic, only this is going on in Rimini, but it is Jerome's picture to make it clear this is Arianism and this is not Arianism, and Valens then was clearly not an Arian. And so it is a reduction on solely the question of the old question of the from a debate on the beginning of the creation. And so it's the second level of the apologetic intention of Jerome one has to take into consideration as well, I think. Yeah, Xavier Morales.
If we still have time, I'd like to make a question to my colleague, Samuel, about the anathematism, and once again, making a comparison with the anathematism that we have from the first session. I know, and Thomas Graumann mentioned this fact, that the authenticity of those anathematism is controverted, but what what surprises me is that on one hand, what Samuel said is confirmed by the first series of anathemisms. I mean, the focus on time. For example, there is one anathema very similar to the second series, where it says that ut ei tempus assignet, what it should not assign a time to Christ. So this is very emphatic. But at the same time, what surprises me is that in the first series of anathemas, the focus seems to be more about the origin, the personal origin, the relation of origin between the Son and the Father. And in fact, the first anathema is about the Son not being from nothing or from another substance, but from God, Father. And curiously, in the second series, the bishops introduce the idea of similarity, which was not in the first series. So it makes me think that the Homean way of considering the relationship between the Son and the Father that was rejected by the first session was finally accepted in the second session. So my question is, why such a reversal? In the first session, this emphatic profession of the origin of the Son from the Father, and in the second session, this acceptation of the similarity.
Oh, well, thank you, Xavier. Your question is really complex in the sense that we should understand the cause of this shift between the first and the second session, the so-called first and second session. I would say that there is a possibility to explain this as a political aim. That is, after this commission went to the East and so on, they decided to shift their understanding of the theology, and then to try to convince all the Western bishops with these ideas. Or it is possible also to think that they understood better the nuances of what they thought was the Arian doctrine, and they understood that they were not as Arian as they thought, and afterwards they were able to explain the Western colleagues that although they have thought that these assertions were absolutely Arians, they had a more Nicene understanding. That is, the very sentence that the Son is a creature, but not as the other creatures, is the parallel of the Son is begotten, but not as the other begotten things. And then there is a, so to say, more Nicene understanding of this shocking, first glance, shocking sentences of the Eastern bishops in the ears of the West, that between the first and the second session could be understood better by this group of bishops, and then they try to convince their colleagues. But it's really speculative because we have very little evidence. But I think that we have to try to understand things without assuming that there was a fraud. That is, to assume the duplicity of Arius and all the Arians and Valens and so on, I think is a too easy answer for these difficult questions.
Are there further questions? Yeah, Mark del Congallo, please.
So I have a question for Samuel. So what do you, this is kind of a speculative question too. So what do you make of the fact that in the revised version of the Nicene Creed, or whatever we want to call that, from the 380s, that the form of the statement, like when the Son was begotten, so it uses that before all ages formula, and not the from eternity formula that's associated like with Alexander and others. So is that creed a kind of compromise, like between an extreme Arian position and a fully Nicene position, like as we understand it? So I'm trying to understand why that kind of creedal language that's found in so many of the Giustibian and Flamoyan creeds makes its way into the official creed from Nicaea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think that we have to go back to origin, as always, no? But on first principle, we have this the explanation, the rule of faith, and according to origin, the rule of faith states that the Son comes from the Father before all ages, before all times. This is the rule of faith. And then, if you think how he came from the Father before all times, this is a theological speculation. Origen has his own theological speculation, that is the eternal generation, and Alexander follows this eternal generation. But Eusebius can have another idea, and Eusebius of Caesarea said, well, in order to protect the reality of the begetting, I should say that the Father is prior to the Son. And then, although everything is before all time, before all ages. And Eusebius of Caesarea himself, he stressed the mysterious character of what happened before all times. And then I think that for the Eastern bishop of Alexandrian tradition, for them, in a profession of faith, should be state that the Son comes from the Father before all time, before all ages. But in a profession of faith, you don't have to explain how he came from the Father before all ages. And then I think that is very consistent, the idea that we have the standard of faith, don't have to go into the details that belong to theological speculations, and you have freedom to think different things. Because if Alexander of Alexandria and Arius both agreed with the standard of the rule of faith according to Origen. One says that, well, there is eternal begetting, and Arius said, no, it's created out of nothing. Yeah? But all of them, both of them, say that the Son comes from the Father before all ages, which is the standard of faith.
So that's a very helpful way of understanding it. So in the revised version of the Nicene Creed, it's just using kind of kind of classical language in there. I just want to push back maybe just on like a little bit. So if there was such kind of controversy over that, one might think that a creed would want to be more specific, so in order to not to allow a a kind of Arianizing interpretation. But that obviously that didn't happen now. So anyway, so thanks for your thoughts though.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hans-Christoph Rennecke, please.
Ich hätte noch eine Frage an Thomas Graumann. Geht das auch noch? This is your idea, Hilary as a source of Jerome, is very interesting, but this part of Hilary we don't have. We have many from the Synod of Rimini from Hilary, I think mostly from Hilary, but this not. And have we any knowledge, what I don't know in moment, have we any can we know anything that Jerome used this work of Hilary in other places? I don't know in moment. I have no.
No, you point out the crucial thing. As regards the first session, we can be reasonably sure that Hilary is the main source. As regards the second, we can't, because, as you said, of the fragmentary nature of the work. We know from his catalog, De Viris Illustribus, that he knew of these works. So yeah, I should say this more cautiously. I quite agree. It seems to me one of the ways in which he might have come across this material secondhand, as I called it, and there aren't too many alternatives at the time. So yes, but the sentence needs to say that hypothetically, I'm inclined to consider Hilary a likely source, and anything more firm than that is dangerous. I agree, and I'm happy to correct my language in that regard.
Okay. Danke.
Yeah, the question of the archives or lost archives or unknown archives is crucial, of course. Well, we know, of course, that from the second session of Rimini, there was sent a delegation to Constantinople again. So there was, in a way, a transfer from material from Rimini to the East. But of course, we don't know where and in what other places this material spread. Where in Constantinople, there should be something about what happened in Rimini. And this is, of course, necessary in a way. They need the material for the follow-up synod there. Is this sufficient?
Absolutely, and that's why it might matter that whether Jerome writes in the late 370s when he's not in Constantinople. Should he have written this in the early 380s when he is in Constantinople? We need to reconsider.
Hans-Christoph?
Yes. Hilary was in Seleucia and then he was in Constantinople. Hilary. And there he had good information indeed to remember. Hilary was at the Synod of Seleucia. And then he went with the delegation to Constantinople in 360. Also, I want to confirm a little bit Thomas Graumann. The possibility of Thomas Graumann.
Okay, thank you. If there are no further urgent questions, I think we can make a little break here now. And we meet again, perhaps at 4:30 here, or at, what is your time, Samuel?
12:30.
Yeah. Well, so in about 7 minutes, and see you again here. And we start with Annette von Stockhausen and the question of Constantinople. See you.
Mm-hmm.
So, not losing time, we proceed now to the decisive central years of the Trinitarian debate, to the 380s, and what's going up in Constantinople in the 380s. And our next speaker is Annette von Stockhausen. And she is, I switched to German, Arbeitsstellenleiterin der Abteilung, die alexandrinische und antiochenische Bibelexegese in der Spätantike at the Berlin-Brandenburgische Akademie der Wissenschaften. She is predestined to present here on this topic because she has worked herself many years on Athanasius and wrote a commentary to Ad Aphros and edited already other pseudepigraphy of Athanasius, and is now finalizing the central issue of the serious documents on the Arian crisis. And so this will, the issue missing still will include now what you have got in a preliminary version, the documents from the synods in Constantinople. Annette, please, we are looking forward to listen to you and hear your presentation.
Yes, Uta, thank you very much for the kind words of introduction, and I'm happy to be able to present you now something absolutely different or totally different, but nonetheless also something which is connected to a very problematic transmission coming to the Synod of 383, and I switch to share my screen, and I hope you can see my screen now. Do you? Yep. Yes, thank you. And I also do it in full screen. In my paper, I'd like to share some thoughts on the Synod of Constantinople in 383, which arose, as Uta already said, in the course of the ongoing edition of the last missing volume of the Dokumente zur Geschichte des Arianischen Streites, the volume with the number 316, which will hopefully published in the next year. So that's the promise. I hope we can keep it. While you soon will see my special twist on the synods in the early years of Theodosius I's reign, I'm indebted to two articles on the Synod of Constantinople in 383 by Martin Wallraff and by Thomas Graumann, to name only these two articles focusing in special on this Synod, besides the greater number of studies on the religious policy of Theodosius in general. And maybe Thomas would have been the better speaker also for this Synod now than me. In my opinion, the Synod of 383 can only be understood if one takes the religious policy of Theodosius I into account, which became quite obvious very quickly after his accession to power. Therefore, I'd like to start with the events 2 years earlier than the Synod of 383. So I'd start, or even a little bit earlier than 2 years earlier, in the year 380. If we look at the beginning of the 380s, we see a deeply divided church between East and West, but also within the Eastern and within the Western part of the Roman Empire. When Theodosius I, who had come to power in the wake of the death of the Humian or Arian Emperor Valens, at the Battle of Adrianople in 378, when Theodosius I eventually reached Constantinople late in the year 380, he wanted to pacify the empire, or at least his part of the empire, by putting through his religious political program of a Nicene restoration, in quotes to be thought, Nicene restoration, that is by empowering the Nicene bishops and churches. With this aim in mind, he convened a synod in his capital Constantinople in the first half of the year 381, which probably from the beginning was also part of a joint plan together with Gratianus, emperor in the West, who convened later that year, 381, also a synod at Aquileia, which, by the way, would also be a good target for a case study on synodical debates as a way to reach unity and failing. The agenda for Theodosius' synod at Constantinople, therefore, was quite straightforward. First, the confirmation, or better reenactment, of the Nicene Creed. And second, the election of a new bishop of Constantinople, as Theodosius had immediately after his arrival in the city removed the Homian bishop Demophilos from office and had him forced out of the city. And after that strange episode of the election of the Alexandrine Maximus, until then friend of Gregory of Nazianzus, as bishop, as obviously staged by Timotheus of Alexandria, and which at least at first, was even recognized in the West. Another sign of the deep conflicts, not the least caused by personal animosities between the churches in the Roman Empire. Due to the death of Meletius of Antioch, the leading figure of the Synod of Constantinople in 381, and due to the abdication of the, at that time, Constantinopolitan Bishop Gregory of Nazianzus, more topics arose during the Synod, but that was definitely not intended by Theodosius. To the contrary, these developments of the events caused the obvious failure of the Synod and a quickly evolving need for new synods. But at the same time, already in Constantinople in 381, like in 383, we see the emperor acting in favor of an enlargement of the Nicene group by incorporating, henosai is the Greek word here, other groups like the Homoousians, the Macedonians, as he calls it, or as Socrates calls it in his church history. And he does that, if we can believe the report in Socrates' history on the Synod of Constantinople in 381. On the other hand, Theodosius also followed a different strategy, namely the repression of non-Nicene groups through legislation, as we can observe in the Law Codex Theodosianus 16, Book 16, 1-3, where the possession of churches is reserved to those of Nicene faith. But this too failed, as at least partially, as the large number of ever repeated, but at the same time becoming more restrictive anti-heretic laws after the Synod. As asked by the emperor, the Synod confirmed all decisions made by the Council of Nicaea in 325 and appointed Gregory of Nazianzus as new bishop, and after his resignation, the newly Christian convert Nectarius. Furthermore, and caused by some events connected to the Synod, it formulated a canon that bishops should not interfere in other dioceses, and that the Bishop of Constantinople, as New Rome, as you all know, should have a honorary precedence over the other bishops, but after the See of Rome. Nonetheless, this canon caused the Western Church to not recognize the canon as well as the Synod of Constantinople in general for quite a long time. Probably due to the ongoing dispute with the West, mainly, but not only caused by Flavian's election as successor of Meletius of Antioch in the context of the Synod, on the one hand, but maybe also due to the missing success with the Macedonians, on the other hand, as well as the obviously still existing activities by all the religious factions in the city, despite the imperial legislation expelling them, a new synod was convened in Constantinople in the following year, 382. This synod remains a bit in the dark, to say the least, as we know of it only thanks to Theodorates quoting its letter to a Roman synod of the same year. So now Theodorates' church history is our source. So it remains quite unclear what the synod was about at all. Perhaps it was also convened by Theodosius, but I'm not so sure about it, to respond to the harsh and uncompromisingly formulated accusations from the West with confirming the Nicene Creed in a neo-Nicene interpretation, as well as the personal decisions of the Synod of 381, that is both the election of Nectarius as Bishop of Constantinople and Flavianus as Bishop of Antioch. But fortunately, we have another source, which is due to its author also not without problems, but which is very instructive for our topic of debates and of failing in the attempt to reach unity by way of discussion. I'm referring to some remarks by Gregory of Nazianzus made in some letters of his, which are most probably to be connected to the events of 382. Gregory of Nazianzus, in his letter 130, which you see in the Greek text on the screen, in his letter 130 to Procopius, a high official in the province of Pontus or in the province of Cappadocia, states, I quote here the translation of Bradley Storin of the letters of Gregory of Nazianzus, quote, "If I must write the truth, here's how I'm doing. I'm staying away from every convention of bishops because I don't see any happy ending to a synod that leans toward an increase in vices rather than a decrease. Yes, the contentious and power-hungry will always be around, along with, don't assume I'm being petulant when I write like this, along with those who are supposedly superior to reasonable discourse. Anyone who passes judgment on vice in others is prosecuted for it, no sooner than he puts an end to theirs." And in letter 133 to Victor, also a high official and also most probably to be dated to the year 382, he admonishes his addressee, quote, again in the translation of Storin, "Since there is again a synod, again a fight, and this between my enemies as they carefully observe all my affairs, give your hand to the general establishment of order so that the church doesn't get the worst portion, and don't neglect everything consumed by the conflagration currently surrounding the church." And likewise, that's the last part of Gregory, in letter 173, now obviously referring to the Synod of 383, he likewise asks his addressee Postumus, the PPO and also addressee of the laws in the aftermath of the Synod of 383, quote, "Since there is another Synod of bishops, I don't know why or how they're convening, consider that there is nothing so proper to your office as bringing peace to the churches by you or through you, even if you're bound to punish the rebels with ferocity. So after his obviously very bitter experiences during the Synod of Constantinople in 381, leading to his resignation, his poem De Vita Sua, as well as his oration 42 Supremum Vale, give, also clausulated and disguised in their wording, a very extensive and therefore more instructive picture of the events at the Synod, and especially of Gregory's feelings and grievances than the short mentions in the letters. Gregory paints a very poor picture of the state of the church and its leaders. To put it short, the bishops quarrel for the sake of quarreling and thus exhibit the worst in them. The purpose of the debate is not to reach consensus, but to dominate and suppress the opponents, that is simply those with other views. Acting like that, they are not up to reach peace in the church and the empire, which becomes obviously when he addresses these high officials. But they are insurgents, stasiazusin, like it is put in letter 173, that endanger the Salus Republicae. And it needs the emperor and his officials to reach and keep peace, both in the church and in the empire. Gregory states in his letter 173 not to know, quote, know why or how they are convening. Uk oida di hoti kai hopos syn argumentum at Constantinople in 383. But what do we know? In spite, maybe better than Gregory, or what he does not tell us at least. As I have tried to show, the two Constantinopolitan synods of 381 and 382 had not been able to fulfill their purpose, the restoration of the unity of the church in Theodosius's domain. Therefore, he made another attempt in 383 and now called on all the theological groups to convene. That's why the famous titulation in Socrates' report as the Synodos Pasonton Haeresion. This, as I've said, is entirely in continuity with his earlier efforts when in 381 he invited at least the Homoousian Macedonians as well as those who were obviously Nicene. But it also shows that the legal steps taken in the aftermath of the Synod of Constantinople in 381 were apparently unsuccessful, and that it was precisely the groups condemned by the law and the following laws that could not be integrated into the church. If one follows Socrates' report, and especially Thomas Graumann in his article has shown us how that we need maybe be quite a bit cautiously, and also Martin Waldorf in his book on the church historian Socrates and his article on the Synod of 383 did that. But if we follow the report nonetheless, as we are in a way dependent on this report to know or to be able to say anything about the Synod, unity was now to be achieved through disputation. And now I'm quoting, the following quotes are all from our document 99.1, the first part of the documentation on the Synod of Constantinople in 383. That is the report by Socrates and followed closely by Sozomen in his church history, which only adds, which is very typical for Sozomen, it's the legislation after the Synod. If one follows Socrates' report, unity was now to be achieved through disputation. Quote, and that's now my translation, for as far as he was concerned, he did not endure that sedition filled the cities, but after a short time, he set about assembling again a synod of all groups. That's the Synodon Parsonton Haireson. I translated Haireses here with groups, faction maybe also, because he thought that from the conversation of the bishops among themselves, one opinion, valid for all, would come to the fore. The emperor imagines that it is possible to remove the dispute by discussion. So discussion as a means of getting to unity. That's in the second part after the 3 dots on this slide. Again, in my translation. So the emperor sent for Bishop Nectarius and consulted with him as to what remedy there was so that Christianity would not be at odds with one another, but that the church would be united. Henoteie. He said that the matter which divided the churches should be examined, and having removed the quarrel, prepare the churches for unity, homophonia, unity in a unity of mind. How naive, as became soon enough obvious, as Socrates reports further on. Nectarius, himself not well acquainted with Christian doctrine, as we may suppose in regard to his biography, refers, and here we certainly have a Novatian influence in Socrates' report, to the Novatian bishop Agelius, who in turn involves his lector Sicinius as the man apt for this kind of problems. That's now the chapter paragraph 4 in the report by Socrates. Quote, Sicinius, who was well acquainted with the interpretations of the sacred writings and the philosophical doctrines, recognized that not only do the conversations not unite their divisions, but even make the parties more quarrelsome. And if we remember Gregory's words, and maybe also our own experiences with disputes in our days, it seems that Sicinius at least knew quite a bit about human nature. Socrates continues again on the slide after the 3 dots. He advised them, so Sicinius, to avoid the dialectical battles, but to call as witnesses the traditions of the ancients, and to have the emperor make an inquiry among the leaders of the groups as to whether they respected the teachers who were in repute in the church before the schism, or whether they pushed them away as strangers to Christianity. Thomas Graumann was, and maybe also still is, skeptical whether this use of a proof from the fathers is historical. But maybe it is not as ahistorical as it seems at first glance after all. When the emperor changes the course of the synod by moving away from an actual disputation to a written discussion, or to the sending in of written statements more than a written discussion, it could be well interpreted as a foreshadowing of the proof from the fathers. So there are documents hinted in, like later in the synods, documents were referred to when discussing who is right and who is wrong. It's maybe not an idea of Socrates, no rewriting of history by Socrates, but a reminiscence of what happened at the synod, as also the evidence from Eunomius' confession that Theodosius ordered a written pistis in which Eunomius, that's what you see now is a quote from Eunomius's Ectasis, where he speaks about ton basilikon prostagmaton, so that Theodosius ordered a written pistis, and in his Ectasis, Eunomius refers to the tradition in almost every sentence, and that's why it maybe is not so Socrates, but maybe really nearer to the historical events. But Sicinius' advice did not result in unanimity, but in even greater dispute, now not only between the groups, but also within the groups. A notion one, by the way, could also get from Gregory's dealing with the events in Constantinople in 381, in which here is bitterly commented by Socrates. That's the 5th paragraph in the report. Again, my translation. When the leaders of the denominations and the debaters heard this from each of them, and there were many of them who were well prepared for the contest of dialectics, they did not know what to do. For a disagreement befell each of them, when some said that the question put forward by the emperor was good, and others that it was not useful to their own purpose. Each had a different opinion about the books of the ancients, and they never agreed with each other. They not only had a different opinion about the other confessions, but also about those among themselves who belonged to their own group. The debate fails. Unity is not to be achieved by debate. According to Socrates, the emperor therefore invites, and as I already referred to before when I mentioned Eunomius, the emperor therefore invites the representatives of the various groups to submit their confessions in writing. Kai deloi engraphon hekaston treskean noricenton horon auto hes echosin pisteos, that each party should make known to him in writing the definition of faith that he has. Finally, in view of the available confessions, the emperor as arbiter decides. And of course, that's no wonder, he decides in favor of the Nicenes and the Novatians, and to the disaster of all others. Quote, the emperor received those who had gathered, and after receiving the teaching of each in writing, when he was alone, he prayed imploringly that God would help him to choose the truth. Then, when he had read each of the written teachings, he censored all the others for introducing a schism from the Trinity, Hoschorismon Triados, and praised only that of the Homoousians. At the end of the synod, there's nothing left from a debate between equals, but a judge, thought guided by God, decides. And the judge, being the emperor, this decision in turn results in laws and repressive actions. Imperator locutus, causa finita, one might sum up. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. And again, we have a respondent. Richard Lim, are you here again? I saw. Okay.
Yeah, he's here.
I'm very sorry. I'm doing it via the phone because I'm using phone data. I don't have internet connection at home, so I apologize in advance for any problems we might encounter. So thank you.
Yeah, so we are very happy to hear your response now. You are a historian at the Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts, and especially it was your monograph on public disputations in 1995, which led us to ask you for a response. And I think your perspective as a historian on the transformation of the cities in the Roman Empire in general, and then in detail on this focus on Constantinople will be inspiring for us all. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you, and thank you, Uta, and thank you, Annette, for a wonderful presentation and also very wonderfully annotated document. So I want to acknowledge that I was very grateful that you presented so carefully the context to the Synod of 383 with the narration of the major events and outcomes of the Council of 381, as well as the less understood Synod of 382. And likewise, your emphasis, I think, on the role of Theodosius is very welcome, because that's one of the questions I might have sort of that I would try to raise for discussion afterwards. So the main source, as you also carefully explained to us, is Socrates, and the source is perhaps basically the basis of Sozomen's very similar description. So there is really very little by way of another independent source that actually gives us information, certainly about the proceedings of the council itself. So you mentioned Gregory of Nazianz's letters that speak to both perhaps the sort of background of suspicion about the value of dialectical disputations. That is a very important part of the actual narration of Socrates here, and also his subsequent perhaps complaint that he wasn't let in onto the actual happenings of the council. And likewise, I think your discussion of Eunomius's ekthesis, as well as the attestation of Euphilas's participation, speak to certainly the facticity of the synod, that there